Tonight, we look back at 60 years of Kenyan diplomacy, 6 decades of managing relationships, influencing regional peace and projecting Kenya's interests on the global stage. But as the country unveils a new foreign policy aimed at advancing economic diplomacy, among others, what does the next chapter of Kenyan diplomacy look like? And how do policies crafted in Nairobi's corridors of power translate to better opportunities, better security and representation of ordinary citizens? Well, to help us answer these questions, I'm joined tonight by Dr. Korir Sing'oei, Kenya's Principal Secretary for Foreign Affairs. Dr. Sing'oei, good evening and thank you for speaking with NTV tonight.
Good evening, Michelle.
So let's begin with Kenya's revised foreign policy. The country recently unveiled a revised foreign policy as the country celebrated its 60th anniversary of diplomacy. What are the key changes in this policy, and how especially do they reflect Kenya's evolving role in the global stage?
I think it's important to point out that Kenya's foreign policy, by and large, since independence, has revolved around pretty much the same issues. At the core, our policy has always been about protecting our national interest. And that has something to do with protecting our sovereignty and our territorial integrity. It has something to do with creating a facilitative environment for our economy to flourish so that our people can be able to get the gains of being free. It has something to do with Kenya being a good neighbor and a good member of the international community. And so in terms of the core, our policy by and large remains the same. We are saying that we will continue being a good member of the international community. We will maintain close relations with our neighbors, amongst others. However, in view of the massive changes that have taken place, both internally and externally, it behooves us to upgrade, if you like, our foreign policy. Our foreign policy, the first documented foreign policy that we have was consolidated in 2014. So it's been 10 years since then. 10 years ago, we didn't have COVID. A pandemic that literally stopped the world on its tracks for the first time and became the #1 peace and security issue. So health can potentially be a peace and security issue. And so part of what you see in our policy is an expansion of the focus areas, an expansion to include what we call social-cultural issues that can threaten the fabric of the society and therefore that require cooperative solution. The other piece that has been really amplified in the policy is the area of global climate change. Yes, it's been, of course, a challenge in years past, but we are facing the greatest brunt of the climate crisis at the present, represented by extreme weather patterns. One year it's flooding, the other year it's droughts. And these cyclical patterns have such serious impacts on our economic security, as well as also on peace and security, because it affects our wildlife, it affects our livestock, because many livestock die when there is drought. And so there is a huge emphasis on the area of climate. The third issue that has changed is tech and technology and innovation. Tech has always been with us, but the pace and the ubiquity of tech and its impact on society has never been to the extent that we feel it today. And therefore, it is in our interest to grapple with the idea of how can we regulate tech? How can we have tech for good? We are beneficiaries of tech today, whether it's M-Pesa, whether it's whether it's mobile telephony, whether it's internet and travel, and all these things are part of tech. But I think the point of our policy now is to really focus on how we can both leverage on tech for good, such as in our Silicon, not our Silicon Savannah, but our Silicon Savannah in Konza, but at the same time try to minimize the impact that tech has particularly on social well-being and social cohesion.
Right, and we'll be getting to those specifically because the revised foreign policy introduces 7 focus areas, and so you've mentioned among them peace and security, climate diplomacy, the digital aspect as well. So let's begin with that peace and security because, you know, just in the opening statement alone, you've mentioned several issues, territorial integrity, issues of sovereignty. Now, Kenya has maintained a strong diplomatic presence globally. I mean, we have 70 diplomatic missions. We've seen Kenyan leaders invited to global platforms, including the G20. We've seen the UN expanding its complex in Kenya. But while the country has maintained a strong diplomatic presence, there have been actions that have raised concerns about the inconsistencies in Kenya's foreign policy, you know, including the perception of alleged complicity in the abduction of foreign nationals in Kenyan soil, the most recent, of course, being Ugandan opposition leader Kizza Besigye. And these have sparked debate over the country's commitment to its principles, especially international treaties on human rights and Kenya's sovereignty as well. So how does this revised foreign policy deal with this perceived alleged complicity in abduction of foreign nationals?
You know, I think first and foremost, it is important to be very clear that Kenya is not complicit in any forms of abduction, and that we deal with very legitimate cases of arrests, including arrests of individuals who could have flouted laws of our neighbors, within our neighboring countries. And so because of our treaty obligations, and it's good you mentioned treaty obligations, we are members of the East African community. And within that context, for example, with Uganda, we have a mesh of frameworks that govern our security relationship. And when you look at certain provisions of the East African Treaty, they provide even for rights of hot pursuit with regard to individuals whom could be considered to have committed a crime in a country such as Uganda. There is a cooperative arrangement between our intelligence communities and authorities to be able to facilitate the return and the handover of individuals that have fallen foul with the laws of their countries. And so there is nothing that the Kenyan authorities did with regard to the individual that you mentioned outside the remit of our treaty obligations and outside the frameworks of our own laws.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because it was not an isolated incident. Weeks before that, Turkish refugees were assisted, essentially back to Turkey by the Kenyan government. Before that, we had 36 of, Ugandans from, again, opposition leader Besigye's party who were transported across the border and charged with terrorism, something that some would call extraordinary rendition. But the reason I'm asking is because we are talking about Kenya's revised foreign policy. And I did go through, the 20-page draft foreign policy that was presented to the president. You'd note that territorial integrity was a key objective. In fact, the issue of national sovereignty is mentioned 14 times in that document. It explicitly talks about the protection of Kenya from external actors that seek to undermine both the Kenyan state and the freedoms and rights enjoyed by citizens. Again, just going back to the event of the former opposition leader, Uganda's opposition leader, Kizza Besigye, is Kenya within this revised foreign policy?
100%. Don't forget, Michelle, that East Africa is on the road to political federation. We already have, a common market. We already have a lot going on between the countries of East Africa. This is the core of, of countries that we relate with economically, socially, at the people-to-people level. There is free movement of goods and services and people. So there is a huge level of interaction. So the border between Uganda and Kenya is it's what I consider to be a very thin border, so to speak. We are increasingly building what is called shared sovereignty within the remit of East Africa. because we have shared norms. We even have a shared court, you know, within the East African Court of Justice. And so it's very well within the context of protecting our sovereignty to also facilitate a country like Uganda to be peaceful,
right?
You know, because it is in the peace, in its peace, that Kenya can be able to benefit in terms of trade and commerce, you know, and other forms of interactions that we have. That's why, Michelle, we are invested in peace in South Sudan. The reason for that is because, you know, this is a market that is of interest to Kenya. It's where our banks can expand their operations. It's where our telecom companies can expand their operations, because our market itself is a small market. 52 million people is not enough for the ambition of our private sector to be actualized and for the potential of our people to, you know, to be optimized. And so we must foster these relationships. But coming to the issue of the Turkish refugees, and I have spoken to this issue quite, you know, quite strenuously, because I did indicate before that we were confronted with a very difficult challenge. Kenya is a refugee hosting nation. It hosts and has been home to millions of refugees. At the present, we are home to more than 700,000 refugees from different nationalities who feel that they're safe in Kenya, and they will continue to be safe in Kenya. All right? But when we are dealing with politically active refugees, that presents a very difficult conundrum, you know, because it reaches a level where if a state raises legitimate concerns about the conduct, you know, of certain of their nationals who are under the rubric of being refugees, then we cannot ignore that, because we are also obligated under another principle, the principle of non-interference in internal affairs of other countries. You know, and so in the context of the Turkish refugees, we were presented, and our intelligence communities shared information that demonstrated that these individuals were enmeshed in activities that, you know, our friendly country in Ankara felt very strongly, you know, ran afoul of their own laws. And they made the request to Kenya, and that request was processed through the intelligence, you know, infrastructure and relationships that we have, you know, and they were handed over with the assurance that they will be accorded fair trial and due process.
So there's been many questions over what some of these failures or perceived failures would mean for, among others, Kenya's seat on the UN Human Rights Council itself. But you know, you mentioned Kenya, you know, being part of the East African community. Did the, you know, and to move on from it, but did the situation with Kizza Besigye, in your view, because you mentioned that Kenya was within its rights, but it took 4 days of international and domestic public pressure to get official government response on this issue. And when it came, it was that the country was not aware why this was happening or what was happening. And so the bigger question was on Kenya's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Do we have any more foreign security officers on the streets of Nairobi, and for what reason?
You know, I would say that our territorial integrity is safeguarded by our national security organs. And if there be any, you know, other members of security from foreign countries, it's really based on very clear frameworks and very clear agreements between our security organs. And those agreements are consistent with our law, they are consistent with our constitution, and they are under constant monitoring to ensure that they remain compliant with our laws, you know, by way of institutions that already are in place.
All right. Now, back to the revised foreign policy, and diaspora is among the 7 focus areas of this new foreign policy. Kenya's ongoing negotiations for labor agreements and the push to expand labor migration with countries like Canada and the Gulf have raised hope of employment, yes, but also concerns about exploitation and modern slavery. What is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs doing to ensure that labor migration agreements projects are aligned with international labor standards?
I think first to point out that the first focus on the part of the foreign ministry is to attract investment to Kenya. And that's why we have invested a great deal in negotiating various economic partnership agreements with different regions, first internally within Africa, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area with the European Union. We have entered into an economic partnership agreement, EPA. With the Americans, we are busy negotiating the STEEP, the Strategic Trade and Investment Partnership Program. All of these are meant to make it possible for a foreign company to set up in Kenya, employ Kenyans, and export to those markets as if it was purely a Kenyan company. And so that's the first port of call. With regard to labor migration, I think let's admit that because our education system, courtesy of the investment of government, produces millions of graduates every year, our market, and our private sector, as well as our public sector, cannot provide enough opportunities for our young people to work. And so it behooves a responsible government to be able to look out for opportunities abroad as well. And in the past, government had not taken a very strong stance, in this regard, and therefore a lot of individuals, a lot of Kenyans used to go to other countries to work without the protection of bilateral labor agreements. Under this administration, the government has done two things. Number one is, to dedicate a very specific State Department, the State Department of Diaspora Affairs, to focus on this issue together with the State Department of Labor, working together in conjunction with our missions abroad. We are entering into partnerships and labor agreements with various countries. These labor agreements set out and stipulate in very clear terms what are the rights of laborers who migrate into those countries, but also what their obligations are. And if you look at the new generation of these labor agreements, they are very, very aligned with our constitution. They're aligned with our labor regulations. And therefore, in terms of consistency, I would argue that the current cohort of labor migrants from Kenya would be able to enjoy a wide range of protections as opposed to those who, for example, went to Lebanon without any safeguards or any protection. But even for those who went under circumstances where they were not well documented or well protected, the Kenyan government is committed to ensuring that their situation is regularized, and if peradventure they're in danger, the Kenyan government as well has invested a great deal of resources to ensure that they are repatriated back home.
Mm-hmm. All right, and of course we've seen in the case of Lebanon, there's been questions over why it takes so long, why the response comes when the Kenyans in diaspora are already in distress. And what then these, more than 70 diplomatic missions are doing to protect the rights of citizens abroad?
To be fair, we had almost 100% repatriation, safe repatriation of Kenyans who were in Sudan. And we even helped some of our neighbors who are working in the Sudan. We even helped members of the international community, including the UN, to bring their staff to Kenya. All right. In the case of Lebanon, the reality is that because a number of these individuals went as undocumented workers, their documents were basically confiscated by their employers, and therefore, even when an opportunity was presented by government for them to register, very few of them, availed themselves because they were afraid that they might face reprisals in the countries where they operate. And so it has taken a great deal of investment on the part of the Kenyan government and a great deal of outreach on the part of the State Department of Diaspora Affairs, the State Department of Labor, to be able to ensure that they are able to come back home. And I'm grateful to say that we have already supported directly as Kenya government, but also in conjunction with the IOM and other partners, almost about 1,000 Kenyans now who are in distress in Lebanon to return to Kenya.
All right. So the new policy, even as we speak about Kenyans going abroad and seeking employment, of course, then needs to fall into needs to align with Kenya's bottom-up economic transformation agenda. And economic diplomacy is then central to the revised foreign policy. What measures have been put in place to simplify the processes for Kenyan businessmen, SMEs, exporters to take advantage of reduced trade barriers within the continent and beyond?
I think that's a very important question. Take, for example, the Economic Partnership Agreement with the European Union. What this agreement does is to provide a framework for Kenyan business people to export to the EU, quota-free and basically tariff-free, as it were. And what the Kenyan government has been doing is in conjunction with with private sector, they've been carrying out quite some outreach and building capacity of private sector to enable them comply with standards, particularly the stringent standards around traceability, to ensure that they do not fall afoul of what is called the Green Deal framework of the European Union. And so there is a great deal of investment on building the capacity of our business to be able to produce commodities and products that align with the standards of the EU, but also that respond directly to the needs that the EU countries require, so that we have a very clear understanding of what the ecosystem is within the EU, what are the needs, what are the requirements, so that from source, we can be able to basically export products and commodities that already meet the safeguards and the standards that the EU has set.
All right, and of course the beauty of foreign policy, in sovereignty is Kenya is seeking its own self-interest, and so to get as many opportunities as possible, especially with economic diplomacy, Kenya has positioned itself in a non-aligned stance, essentially avoiding formal alignment with either the East, and that is, influences like China, Russia, as well as the West. How does this approach provide Kenya with what I would call perhaps more diplomatic flexibility and economic opportunities, and how is that working out?
I would say that non-alignment has been a very steady policy for Kenya since independence, since Mzee Jomo Kenyatta pronounced himself that we neither look east nor west, we look forward. I think borrowing from, I believe, Kwame Nkrumah and other Pan-Africanists. We are back sort of to a quasi-Cold War situation right now, where there are new global realignments. But what Kenya has done consistently is that we have built and we've forged partnerships with different countries, notwithstanding their position, their political position, so to speak. And so we have a very strong relationship with China, for example, just the same way we have a very strong and strategic relationship with the United States, just like we do have a relationship with Europe. And so I would argue that non-alignment has been a very positive logic. We will continue under the new policy, and we indicate that, for example, that even though we believe in multilateralism, in fair multilateralism, because the multilateral system is facing major shocks. It's failing to address serious challenges the world is facing. We will continue to work around the clock to ensure that there is reform of the multilateral order to align with our interests. But at the same time, we are also looking at new arrangements, and we are calling them plurilateral arrangements. These are interest-based coalitions of countries that are not necessarily geographically contiguous to each other. And we are saying that we might be forced to join some of the plurilateral formations to be able to advance our interests, our commercial interests, our security interests, while at the same time continuing to work on this project of strengthening, multilateralism. We've been members of the Commonwealth for a very long time. That's an example of an old plurilateral arrangement. We've been members of the Non-Aligned Movement. Again, it's a movement. That's another example of a plurilateral arrangement. But there are newer plurilateral arrangements that we will be considering membership to, if we do find that being members of these institutions would be able to afford us greater opportunity to grow our economy, and to safeguard our other interests.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned that, because under foreign policy, there's been a significant push for de-dollarization in Africa. How does Kenya's revised foreign policy plan to leverage on regional initiatives, for example, within the continent, like the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, which is developed by the Africa Export Bank, to strengthen Kenya's economic position, enhance intra-Africa trade? And then where does de-dollarization come in?
I don't think de-dollarization is a factor at all. I think what is a factor is trying to create a framework by which Africans can trade using their own currencies, because it makes no sense at all for Kenya and Uganda to trade, on the basis of the US dollar. Okay, it makes no sense at all for Kenya and Ghana to trade using, that currency. So the point for us really is to say that there is merit in being able to develop an African settlement system that will facilitate trade between our countries on the basis of our respective currencies. So enhancing convertibility, of these currencies without necessarily recourse into, to the US dollar.
Right, and so like you mentioned, Kenya, may be looking to position itself very strategically. There's been, Kenya is positioning itself as a leader within the African Union, in regions like COMESA itself. What is the ministry's long-term strategy to sustain this influence, especially within the continent?
I think we are well poised to sustain that influence. We already have, in the region, about 26 missions in Africa. Our aim is to grow these missions to probably every African country, because if you look at our ambition as a country that wants to support peace and security, wants to exercise continental leadership, I think it's important to have more missions, and that is why, as part of this policy, the Prime Cabinet Secretary, and ourselves as PSs are working on a sessional paper on foreign policy. And what the sessional paper will do is that it will be presented to Parliament, and it will have a proposition in terms of how do we finance, our foreign missions, for example, including through the PPP framework. Because the argument that we make here is that we spent about 70% of our budget on our missions abroad. So only about 30% is spent here at the national level. And so of the 70% of the budget that we spent abroad, a good percentage of that goes into rents and things like that. And yet the reality is that most of our missions abroad are going to be there in perpetuity. Why don't we invest in developing our assets abroad? We already have quite some assets, some properties abroad, but some of them are not in the greatest condition. And so that's why we're saying we're presenting before Parliament a proposal that will unlock the potential, of our assets that are already in our hands, and it's also making proposals about how we can make further acquisitions and further developments. Yeah.
And so part of the conversation, especially within the East African community, has been to ensure peace and security for economic prosperity. With the ongoing conflicts in the Horn of Africa and Kenya's emphasis on peace diplomacy, including mediation efforts in South Sudan, which Kenya resumed recently, how is Kenya's role as a regional peace builder evolving under the new foreign policy, even on the backdrop of negative, criticism, so to speak, on Kenya's influence or mission in Haiti?
I think let's make it clear. Our mission in Haiti is it's well-founded. It is a celebration of our commitment to Pan-Africanism, our commitment to Africans in the diaspora, Africans who were transshipped from this continent by force as slaves, okay? And so solidarity with Haiti is something that our African brothers and sisters truly honor and celebrate, okay? And so we need to make that clear. And that is why, as part of this mission, for example, we have had quite some support from a number of African countries. Some of them have even willing to contribute troops in the manner in which we are doing. And some of them, like Algeria, for example, have actually contributed money to the trust fund. Right. Okay? So in terms of our peace building strategy, and I think it's very clear that Kenya stands in a very unique position, as an arbiter that has no other interest except to secure peace. So we are a very non-partisan country because we truly believe in the territorial integrity of other countries. We believe very strongly with evidence that we have no interest in the political developments that are happening within the neighborhood. And therefore, countries feel free to reach out to us. They feel confident that if a process is brought to Nairobi, we can be able to forge consensus. And as part of the demand, therefore, from our friends in Somalia, from our friends in Ethiopia, from our friends in South Sudan, from our friends in DRC. As part of that demand, we are building capacity for mediation and for negotiation. And tomorrow we'll be unveiling a new Foreign Service Academy that has a council and has curricula to be able to develop particularly our young diplomats, and to build the next generation of mediators and negotiators who can be able to sue for peace and negotiate for peace, in other parts of the world. All right.
We're just about to wind up, but you mentioned that Kenya is likely to attract more foreign direct investment, particularly in form of PPPs. What safeguards are in place to ensure that these investments promote equitable development, benefit local communities, go where they're supposed to go, while aligning with Kenya's sustainable development goals?
I think that's a big question. I think we do need to strengthen our PPP framework so that it accords even more, with our constitutional order, so that people can develop the confidence that this project has been negotiated in a way that is consistent with their interests, not just in the present but also in the future, because some of these PPPs are also very long term, and so the payment periods are over a 30-year period. So they affect not only the present generation, but the future generation. And so people have to have the confidence that the investments that are being negotiated are being given, they're taking care of their interests. They're not burdening not only the present, but or the future. And therefore, I think we need to look at the legislative framework. We need to look at the policy. We need to strengthen oversight. But from the perspective of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, our work is to project Kenya's readiness, as a destination that is attractive for investment, that is ready for investment, and the work that we are doing together with our colleagues in trade, our colleagues in investment, our colleagues in National Treasury, is to be able to work around building our own capacity to negotiate the best deals, for Kenya and for the Kenyan people.
All right. And, there's been a lot of uncertainty over the U.S. election and, President Trump coming in. And when, he was president during his first term, the U.S. withdrew, huge amounts of funding towards the country because of corruption. How has corruption impacted foreign policy initiatives, especially bilateral initiatives?
That's, again, a very important question, because I think we need to acknowledge that corruption is one of the factors that sometimes undermines foreign direct investment. However, it is not true that during Trump 1, there was a stoppage of any project that had been earmarked for Kenya on account of allegations around corruption. I think the reality is that, as a matter of fact, during Trump 1, that's when we started negotiating a free trade agreement regime. And the reason for that, Michelle, is because the US considers Kenya to be a very critical ally on the peace and security front. It considers Kenya to be, a stable nation and to be a showcase in terms of the power of private sector, as well as democracy. And so the understanding that corruption is something that we need to work on, and we are working on, and the right institutions that are empowered to deal with, has not at all negated or undermined or diminished the power of this relationship. It is, in fact, our view that during Trump 2 term, I think we will see even an increase, in the investment, from United States, both from the private sector, but also much more importantly from the public sector.
And perhaps finally, with this new revised foreign policy 60 years later, when you look ahead, what are some of the biggest challenges that Kenya's diplomacy is likely to face within the next decade?
I did mention the fragile multilateral order, which means that building consensus, building collective action to address big challenges is increasingly difficult. We have, like we said, we have a climate crisis in our doors, and yet, if you look at the latest COP, the Conference of Parties, the 29th Conference of Parties, there was hardly any agreement with regard to climate financing and how we deal with it. And so we see that the biggest challenge that we face going into the future will revolve really around collective action. How do we forge collective action to deal with peace and security issues, or to address peace and security issues? How do we deal with collective action with regard to the climate crisis and other crises that will emerge?
All right, Mr. Korir, your final comments to Kenyans. Many Kenyans view foreign policy as abstract. What are they expecting from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with this revised policy that will directly benefit them?
And so what we've done is, over this week, starting Friday last week, we have engaged in an exercise of opening up the ministry to citizens, so that the citizens can provide feedback about what we are doing well, and how we could do it better, so that they could understand and appreciate more, the impact of our programs. And so from where we sit, I think this foreign policy will truly accelerate the level of investment into the country. It will deepen our development partnership with different countries and different institutions. But more importantly, it will center citizens in the process and in decisions around foreign policy. And that's why, post the launch of the policy, we intend to take it mashinani. We intend to take it to the county so that we can explain to citizens the different elements of the policy. We intend to translate it into Swahili, and we intend to disseminate it very, 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 very widely.
All right. And perhaps just one more question, because we did ask Kenyans to give in feedback. So Geoffrey here is asking, why is our Foreign Office not helping indigenous Kenyans sell tea, coffee and nuts, etc. to our European partners directly through opening shops in Berlin, London, Warsaw, without using brokers?
I think that's precisely what we are doing. We have tons of examples in this respect. Today, if you go to a supermarket in Berlin, you will find, products that are branded directly from Kenyan farmers. You'll find Kenyan avocados. You'll find Kenyan flowers. So, but the reality also, to tell Geoffrey, is that because we are dealing with big markets, these products need to be aggregated. In order to meet the demand, and to meet that demand on a continuous basis, and in order to satisfy the standards Okay, and so that's why the emphasis has been here around, county aggregation plans to enable us to build a whole value chain that can meet, the demand of, of different markets. So yes, I think there are standalone businesses that are able to penetrate into this market thanks to the agreements that we have forged. But I think most businesses really want to work with others in order to be able to meet, bigger demands, so to speak.
Yeah. All right. Principal Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Korir Sing'oei, many thanks for speaking to us here
Thank you very much.
On NTV. That conversation bringing us to a close on NTV tonight. Many thanks for watching. My name is Michelle Ngele Odhiambo. Flora Atieno is the sign language interpreter. On behalf of all of us here at NTV, good evening. Thank you for watching.